Yeah. Okay, I think we are live. Nadika, you let me know if there are any issues.
All good, my end. We can begin.
Okay, thank you. Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to day 8 of Meta 2024. To end the festival this year, we have um, a very world famous celebrated writer, Carmen Maria Machado, who has won several writing awards for her short stories and her and her memoir called In the Dream House. Just before we begin, I'd also like to thank Shifali here, who is currently at the Iowa Writers Program. And it's thanks to Shifali's connection and conversations with Carmen Machado that this is possible today. So just to start with, thank you to both of you for being here and for making Meta doubly international. Um, yes, okay. To start off with, one thing that so read The Husband Stitch, like I just mentioned a few minutes ago. So The Husband Stitch was published in 2014, October 2014, if I'm not wrong. And since then, I think we've had batches of students at our college, at our university, who've been reading your story every year. So there's a new bunch of young people, and they have certain ideas about life, femininity, being, relationships. And then there are stories like The Husband Stitch that enter their lives and kind of allow us as teachers to transform them, and also allow students themselves to become newer people. And I think that was also that was the experience that both Shifali and I also were privileged to have, to sit in a classroom and read these words for the first time. And ever since then, and ever since I started teaching a few years ago, I've seen students become different people, especially young women, who kind of start to sit up a little bit more as we're reading the story in class, and see them transform into slightly more empowered women than they were, say, a few minutes ago. So we're all very, very excited that we get to hear from you today. Um, I think to start us off, we'd love to hear a little bit about what your writing life was like in your earlier years. I think one thing that I think most of us have discovered in your stories is some kind of ferocity, some kind of fierce energy in your female characters, in your writing, and this completely unapologetic way of being. And what I've also noticed is that this doesn't simply have to do with the characters, but your writing itself. So as I'm reading you, I'm constantly um, in awe, because there's this desire, there's this passion that becomes louder with every word. So my question is that I would love to hear a little bit about what writing is like for you, and how do you kind of place this, or what does this desire mean for you?
Hmm.
Desire to write.
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny because I feel like I get asked a lot about why I became a writer or like what my journey was toward writing. And obviously every
Mhm.
person has their own path and their own sort of way of getting there. And for me, I feel like I was always every time I tried to do something different in my life, it always like I kind of like got pointed back toward writing. Like even though I wanted to be a doctor for a while, like I thought about
Seems
being
like a
I
very
was I
nice
studied
lady, actually.
photography in
Almost.
college, you know. So I've done all these other things, and yet I feel like also like writing always just became the thing that I sort of returned to. Um and I don't know. I mean, I think that like once I started doing it, I think there's also this question about like voice. Like people often ask, like,
Mhm.
where does your voice come from? Or like, where does one's voice come from as a writer? And the way that I think about it is always like, what do I have to say? And like, how do I say it? And I think for me, like, you know, the idea that I'd be writing about things that I would find really important, things like questions about gender and sexuality and you know the fat body and queerness and like things about in my life that like and other things that are like less sort of embodied, like also things like I don't know, making bad choices. I'm writing this book right now that's like all about like how one often is drawn back towards one's worst impulses. So like even just stuff that's like, but like those things are interesting to me. And then I don't know, I think that like and then like the method of telling always seemed to be letting genre be interesting, which is, you know, also just like because the work that I read where genre, it's like really genre forward, like it's really interested in this question of like, what is reality? What does reality look like? That's always been really interesting to me.
Yeah.
And then yeah, and then I think also writing, I mean, you said like unapologetic or like writing really directly, but like not being coy for a better word, I guess, like letting the characters sort of do what they want and letting the story. And I went through like a lot of phases of like, can I do this? Like I remember when I was working on in my first book, I have this story called Especially Heinous, which is this like
Yeah.
really surreal, like I don't know how to describe. I feel like it's really hard to describe it. It's basically
Yeah.
like surreal Law and Order fan fiction that's about sexual violence. And I remember when I was writing it in grad school, I was like, can I do this? Like, am I allowed to do this? Like, is this? And then I was just like, well, I guess someone will tell me if I can't, you know, somebody will say like, and so I feel like, yeah, like a lot of my writing has just always been me kind of pointing in various directions and then just like
Hmm.
figuring it out and just being okay, like I guess this is what I want to do. And then people really responded to it. And I think that like, you know, even I mean, when you were reading The Husband Stitch, I didn't even have a full book out yet. I mean, The Husband Stitch, yeah, that was like, I mean, that came out, yeah, it was like, I think it was 2014. That sounds right. Like, so 3 years before I even had a book out in the world. So also I think that when I was getting responses from people who were reading it, like it was such a profoundly rewarding experience. People were like reading it and responding to the thing I was writing in this really
Yeah.
intense way. And that only kind of like incentivized me to keep doing it, I guess, you know, to keep like
Yeah.
writing in this
Yeah.
mode. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I have a small follow-up question. Has your process or your relationship with writing changed after having published your books?
Yeah, it has. It has changed in a few ways. I mean, for one, I think that like there's no book like your debut in the sense that when you're writing a debut, it isn't that you're not touched by like
Yeah.
capitalistic forces, because obviously you are, like you have to live and eat and be
Mm-hmm.
in the world and pay rent and do all that
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
But it is like a unique space to be in because you don't have a track record of any of really like you're just sort of like you're almost this like blank slate as an artist. And so it's like a different space that, and then and like also I think because that first book did so well and it was so successful, I also was able to write like this memoir, which was really like weird in a lot of ways, and I think would have been hard to sell first. But the fact that my first book did really well, so it's like just like a different space.
Okay.
And then also I feel like my work has also changed like from like post COVID and like I don't know, like yeah, your career just like changes, right? And as you sort of progress through it, like the forces that are kind of working with you and against you in the world just like shift and change.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you. Shifali, you want to?
I was thinking about what you just said about writing about real things, and you also write speculative, and I was wondering, something I talk to a lot of people about that you said and that I just keep quoting is write the story that burns within you. And it's something that's, I think, given me permission to write things that are important to me and the things that haunt me in many ways. And I wondered if you could talk about using the speculative elements to talk about the real things that haunt us.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think so. The first story that I wrote, what I think of as like the first story in my current voice, or like not my current voice, but the voice that like because I wrote stories even when I was in grad school that like no one will ever see except for like my classmates, right? Because they just weren't very good. And like my first semester, it was kind of a wash. It was just like I was still trying to figure out like what I was doing. And then once I began thinking about genre in this way, there was a story I wrote that was in my first book called Difficult at Parties, which is a story about sexual violence and uses this device of the protagonist of the story hearing the voices of performers in pornographic films. And so she's able to like access their interiority, and it becomes like part of this quest for her own interiority, which has been stripped away because of sexual violence. And it was one of the, I remember having this like thought, or like having this conversation with myself about like how you talk about sexual violence in a new way. And this is a thing that like, I mean, obviously then I wrote Especially Heinous a few years later. Like this is like a thing that's, or like the next year actually, like this is a thing that's like very interesting to me, is like, how do you tell a story that's been told, or how do you tell a story that people are going to have like really strong reactions to in a way that feels like fresh and interesting? And for me, genre, so like approaching the material almost like diagonally or sort of sideways, like from this sort of alternate mode of reality, is a way of like refreshing the reader's relationship with the material. So, you know, the question becomes not just like, what does it mean to have like experienced sexual violence and feel like your own interiority has been like stripped away from you, but like, what if it literally is? And the only way you could access it is this like very strange device. Like, what does that mean? You know, what does it mean to be like alienated from your body and your sense of self in this way? So, you know, I think that genre, non-realism, speculative fiction, all kinds of modes of storytelling have like, there's like a value to that for all kinds of reasons, including the fact that it does like, it's this way of like refreshing or defamiliarizing the text, which is this idea, you know, that like people have talked about with like, you're just like looking at it in a different way, and just this way of like accessing the information in a new and fresh way. So it just kind of became, and my brain just like sort of thinks in that mode now. Like I feel like it's kind of like almost a mad thought.
Okay. I think the first time I came across some of your work, whether it was in class or outside of class, it didn't even strike me that this is genre fiction as opposed to literary fiction. I think another interesting thing that happens, because you're also I mean, most genre writers do this, but because you're asking incredibly complex questions about being and interiority, and how people react to different moments and situations. I think I never made that separation in my head, because it always seemed as real as something that might happen to me on the road, for example. So incredibly psychological experiences, or heartbreak, or anything that's happening, that yeah, I think that that was very fascinating, particularly with, say, even the husband stitch, for example. Yeah, yeah. So okay, I can you tell us a little bit about, you mentioned of some writers, some speculative fiction or genre fiction writers that you read. Can you tell us a little bit about that process? I know you've mentioned George Saunders and a couple of other people.
You mean like mentioned writers that or just like
Yes. Yeah, the
reading in
writers that
general?
you, yeah, yeah. In terms
Yeah, I
of
mean,
your
this was like a huge part of my, so I mentioned how like my first semester at school was like pretty much a wash, and it was. And one of the things that really helped me, I feel like, lock into what would become like the way that I actually wanted to be writing was like my class. I remember like a classmate who's now a really good friend. He was observing that something I had written in class. He was like, "You're not interested in the story you've written. Like, you seem really disinterested in the material you're writing," which I also, like, now that I'm a teacher, I also notice this when this happens, where like a person is writing and maybe they're a good writer, but like they're not fully invested in like whatever is happening on the page. But he was like, but there's a moment in the story where like death appeared and like talked to this character, and he was like, that was the moment where the story like came to life. Like, you seemed suddenly really interested in what you were doing. So clearly there was like this moment that was like kind of strange, reality bendy, genre bendy, folktale-y, that like I clearly was like interested in. And so I remember spending that entire first winter break of school reading like Kelly Link, Karen Russell, Helen Oyeyemi, Angela Carter, Shirley Jackson, and just like inhaling all of this stuff, and realizing that this was a way that I wanted to be telling stories, is like using genre as this mode. Like, all the writers I was reading were like non-realists, or like, or something adjacent to it, right? So they were operating, and some of them I would say, I mean, words like genre and literary, I feel like, are obviously really loaded, and people use them in different ways. And I think of those things as, and I won't go into it because that's like I'll talk for like a full hour about just that. But I think that like those are all writers coming from different like places in sort of the in various like genre world, literary world, whatever, but they're writers who are really interested in this like permeability, this malleability, this liminal space, like this kind of like weird thin place that like is very strange, and I think that and is like truer than like maybe certain other kinds of realism. And to be clear, I also love realism. Like I read realism all the time and really love it. It's just for me as a writer, it's not really like the thing. Like I need something. There has to be a ghost or something. It's funny because I do occasionally. I'm actually working on something right now that so far has no supernatural element of any kind. It has no genre element, and I keep being like, should I add like a ghost or something, or is it gonna come and I just don't know it yet? It's just funny because I feel like I'm so used to it, and like I was talking to someone about it, and they're like, wait, this sounds like a realist thing you're describing, and I was like, maybe I don't know. It's kind of a weird thing. Anyway, but yeah, for me, I just think that like it was really like having those writers and accessing those writers and realizing that like people have been thinking this way for a really long time. This is also nothing new. It's not like, obviously there are a lot of writers I mentioned who like died before I was born, who were doing this work, And so it was just like, to me, just felt like a space that was really rich. And when I'm feeling, uh, blocked in some way, it's rereading those writers is often the way that I get unblocked because I feel, yeah.
Okay. All right. Shivali?
Yeah, on a side note, Carmen, so you came and visited Iowa. This is like a really side note, but like you visited Iowa last year and you talked about how you spent that semester hot break reading. And so a bunch of people did the same thing after you said that, and they called it the Machado method.
Wait.
Just like
Say the first part of that again. Wait, I missed. Sorry. Machado method. Wait, what?
so basically spending winter break or summer break just reading books instead of writing.
Got it.
Using the books you read to like influence, like inspire you. It became known as the Machado method in our year.
Wait, I've never. I did not know that. That's very funny. Okay. Great. I love
So
that.
like yeah, a lot of us were like, we have to do this.
Oh my God, I love that. It makes me so happy.
Yeah. I
But I
have a
think
question.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Well, I was gonna say, but I just wanted to say also that like I think this is a thing that people also like when I do like residencies and stuff too. This is also what really helps me. Like and I feel like when you alight upon a text that is like helpful to you in some way, your brain will just fire. So I remember like one time at a residency reading Thomas Bernhard's Woodcutters, which is like not really a genre novel. It's like sort of a satirical novel about the Austrian art elite, but it's super funny. It's like a very bitchy book. It's like this guy just like at a party, super mad about how everyone sucks. And it's like very funny. And for most of the novel, he's sitting in a chair by himself, just thinking about how everybody at this party sucks and he hates them. And I remember reading this novel and being like, stop the presses. I want to write. So I literally sat down and wrote a draft of a story of a character at a party in like different circumstances, but like at a party, just like sitting and like thinking all these like circular thoughts. And I think that that's like the best of what that kind of reading can do, where you read and also like reading outside of your comfort zone, like reading a book that maybe you would not have picked up normally. It's like, it's like an older book or a book you've never really heard of, or like outside of your normal genre, or like not really, and like just finding that like there's this other mind that you can access, this other person or this like text that you can see, and then like you can also like access that creative space. It's just, to me, it's the most exciting thing about reading, honestly. Anyway, okay, I'm done.
No, I love that because I feel like your work's done that for us. Like it's given us permission to do things we didn't think, like reading your work that we didn't think we could do. And I think both Rishi and I can like talk about that. But that actually does lead me to my question really well. Which is for the longest time I've thought of the body and the mind as two separate things. And one thing our teacher Vidya used to talk about was the idea of full body reading and full body writing. And I recently realized that I think through your work more than anyone else's, that the body is related to that which is in the head, the emotions, and I was wondering if you could, how what we touch like tells us something about what we cannot touch. And I was wondering if you talk a little bit about how the very physical being of the body can relate to that which is intangible.
I mean, I think the idea that like the mind and body are not separate is a really good and useful one. And I think that there's this like, I will say, not to be kind of this very male impulse to like separate the mind and the body, to be like, there's this idea of like pure intellect, or this idea of like the mind as this like pure thing. And the fact is like that's not true. Like the mind, your brain is a part of your body, and your mind, like the way that your body is sort of functioning in the world, whether that's like the literal processes like moving through your body at any moment, or like just like, yeah, like your existence in the world like is inevitably will shape consciousness. And I think that like, I don't know, I'm thinking a lot about like Ted Chiang's like Story of Your Life and Others, which is about like this idea that like language shapes consciousness, or like language can shape reality, that like the way that we think about linguistics. So like everything is all connected. And which sounds so like hippie, like, oh, everything's connected, but it is really. And I think that like, and the fact is like, your body can exist without your brain. Like you could be a body and your brain dead, and your body can exist for a really long time, but like the other doesn't work the other way around, right? Like, so I just feel like your mind cannot exist without your body. And so I just, for me, it just feels like this continuum of experience that I think is just, yeah, it's just truer to oh, I don't know why I did that. It's just truer to reality. It's like the yeah, those things exist together. And I mean, and I'm thinking about this right now, like, you know, I had, you know, I have some like brain fog, like, I don't know if it's long COVID exactly, but I have some like stuff like that. And like, that's a reality, which is like something in my body has affected the way my mind works. And I have to like create processes to like work around this reality of my mind and like, and my body. And you just can't, what are you going to do about that? It's just, that's just how it is. Like, I'm not even like saying a thing. It's like, there's just no such thing as like pure intellect. There's no such thing as just a mind that is like separate from the body. They're all part of each other. And I think that when you have to like realize that and like comprehend that and internalize that and then like respond accordingly. Yeah. But I think a lot of people, I think people whose bodies are politicized know that inherently. Like, I think on some level, if you are like not white, if you're a woman, if you're queer, if you're trans, if you're like, you know, on some level that like your body is a politicized thing, and like it affects like your experience, which affects your mind and you know, your way that you exist in the world. And I think that like, I think some people just don't realize that for like reasons of not having to really have thought about that ever critically in their life. But
Okay. Okay. May I? Yes, Shefali?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I'm very curious about this, especially what I think even where Shifali's question is coming from. I think after I read In the Dream House, one thing that stood out to me was it's about an abusive relationship, but I found that I could relate to it in several different ways. And one thing that stood out to me was also, of course, the relationship with the self, but also with the body. And I was also reminded of your essay, The Trash Heap Has Spoken. And then I think most recently you also wrote about the whale. And I was looking at it again on your Substack. And I'm very curious about this. One is writing as a queer person, but as when you're writing as a fat person also, for me it feels liberating in some sense, because when I'm writing, then I'm in some sense not a fat person anymore, because then I'm just a person who's writing. And that can feel very empowering, but at the same time it might also seem like a rejection of a very important part of your identity. I'm curious about how writing might or might not have changed your relationship with your body, or how you view yourself.
oh, that's such a great question. I mean, I think that like, so the trash heap, okay, I feel like I should go. So for years and years, I wanted to write an essay about fatness. Like, it was really important to me. It was something that, like, I knew I wanted to do. And the fact was, a lot of the writing on fatness that I was seeing at the time, and this would have been like in the early part of the last decade, a lot of that writing was very superficial. Like, it was about really basic stuff. And obviously there's a lot of writing, like Kate Mann has this really great new book about fatness. Like there's a lot of really good writing on fat phobia as like a structural issue that's been coming out in the last few years. A lot of like Aubrey Gordon, like there's a lot of writers who are doing like really important work on that, which is like not even also like that's like important work that's more like I'd say like academic, which is like also not quite what I do as a writer. But I knew there was something I wanted to do. I was like, I feel like there's something I want to say about fatness, but I couldn't figure out exactly what it was. And I feel like fiction, I feel like, is a place where I get to like process ideas because I have access to these like non-realist devices, like, or at least just things that I can invent, right? Because like if I'm going to write an essay, I have like the parameters of reality and like nonfiction and research and all this stuff. But like with fiction, I can just sort of do what I want, right? I can just create anything kind of whole cloth. And so I remember writing this story that was my first book called 8 Bites. And that story came from, I had read this memoir whose title is eluding me, by this writer named Jen Larson. And it was a memoir about gastric bypass surgery. And there was this like kind of not throwaway line, but there was a line in the memoir that just said, she was like losing all this weight from the surgery. And she said, it was as if I had lost a whole person, like the weight of a whole person or like a whole body. And I was like, oh, that's so interesting. It's like you have 2 bodies and then suddenly there's like the body is like missing. There's like this missing thing. And so I wrote this story about a woman who's like literally haunted by her lost body, because she's had this weight loss surgery. And it was only when I was writing that story that I was able to sort of access a set of thoughts that I was having about fatness, not just, so part of it was this idea that like, that our bodies are these like really incredible animals that like ferry our like ungrateful brains through this terrible world, and all we do is like starve them and hate them and like yell at them and pinch them and like do all this stuff to them, and like that our bodies deserve so much better than that. And that like that can be like a really essential part of who we are, and that something is lost when like the body is like shifted in this really radical way or like altered in this way, which I feel like it's weird because I wrote that story 10 years ago and now we're in this age of like Ozempic and like all these like weight loss drugs, right? So it's like it's just everything old is new again. But yeah, so, and then I finally sort of had language to talk about this idea that I'm also talking about in the essay, The Trash Heap Has Spoken, which is this idea that like, what if my fatness aids me? Like, what if this quality of my body makes me smarter and better and more interesting and a better writer? Because I have this way of accessing the world that like some other people don't. And I take up more space quite literally in the world, not just like metaphorical space, but like literal space. And yeah, sorry, I've kind of forgotten your question. I'm just like thinking about, so yeah, but I feel like this is like what I'm talking about, where like I was sort of following this path of like this question where I was like, there was something I was thinking about. And this, this journey of like writing about fatness has been at this point like ongoing for like over a decade, where I've just been like thinking about, because the person was just like, I don't know, I had a body. I feel like also my writing has become better as I get more in touch with my body. Like I feel like when I was younger, I was just kind of alienated from my body in every way possible, right? Like in terms of like my fatness, in terms of like my sexuality and just sex and desire, like all these ways that I was sort of pulled away and alienated from my body. And I feel like the more that I've leaned into it and been like, what space am I occupying? How am I embodied? Like my writing has gotten better because I think that, again, because I think these processes are all connected to each other. Like I don't think they're separate in any way. I think they're actually, and I think that sometimes, I mean, people write for all kinds of reasons and there's all kinds of pleasures associated with writing, but I think that there is something really true about like the occupation of the body as fully as possible being a way of like occupying your own practice or your own like artistic self as fully as possible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's lovely. I think I'm going to be thinking about this for a long time. Okay, just before we continue with our questions, those of you who are watching on YouTube can start leaving your questions now, and we'll take them in a few minutes. My colleague Nadika had something to say in response to this. Nadika, do you want to unmute?
I don't know if I have a completed thought. I don't think there's anything here, but it's just like hearing all this talk is sort of the thing that um, so I'm a fat person, I'm a trans person, I'm very clumsy, right? And there's a way that I move in the world that is that is if people were to describe it, it'd be graceless. It's almost like gomless, right? Um, and and hearing you talk about this, I'm wondering, but the physical body is something that I've always been aware of, but it's something that I want to cut away from me, because for me, my who I am is my head, my brain, things that that goes on in there. But I've always felt that my brain is separate from my body. My body is just a very inefficient vessel to carry around my thoughts in. And I was, you know, hearing you talk about with embodiment, that's something that I've thought about a lot. As a trans person, as a fat person, I'm just, I don't know where I'm going with this, but in terms of like just resolving all of these things, it's a very complex sort of way to look at myself, right? And I'm not sure where it can go with that.
Yeah. And I don't know if this is like exactly a response, but just as you were talking, I was thinking about how like I also think there's this thing about embodiment where people think, and I'm not, this is just in general, I think that like when people are operating from positions of, and I use neutrality sarcastically because there's such thing as a neutral body, right? Like all bodies are politicized in some way, but like people who are occupying from spaces where they think that they're neutral, so they're like male, white, straight, cis, like, you know, thin, and they're operating from these spaces that are these like socially acceptable bodies that like have this, I think that people think like that people whose bodies are othered are then like missing something essential about neutrality. But the fact is like, there's like things you can't access in every direction. So like a person who's very thin cannot access, there's like experiences they also cannot access, right? In the same way that like the fat body also can't access. And like this is true in every direction, right? That there are just like ways in which like bodies can and cannot access other experiences. And that's not about like loss, it's just about difference. Like it's about the ways in which and that is why embodiment is so important, because like there's all these like sort of multiplicity of experiences that like just speak to like different ways of moving around in the world, and they're just different. Like they're not about like, oh, you can't. And I feel like it's weird too, because I think also part of the tragedy has spoken, like part of that essay and part of my kind of like ongoing, I wouldn't call it research because it's very passive, but like my ongoing kind of interest in like how we talk about fatness, especially as it relates to art and artists, is the way that people treat the fat body as having an inherent negative position on the mind. So like I talk about in that essay this quote that was from the Shirley Jackson biography that came out a few years ago, where the biographer was interviewing some family friend of Shirley Jackson, who's also been dead for many, many years, and the friend was talking about how like the friend was like, oh, she would go to these parties and she would sit on the couch because Shirley Jackson was a fat woman, and she'd be like, she took up half the couch, but she was so funny and witty and smart, and everyone loved talking to her at these parties. And it's weird because like the biographer doesn't push back on the butt, which I thought was like so interesting. I was like, that's just, what a weird quote, because like you can't say she was so fat, she took half the couch, and she was delightful and funny and witty and wonderful to talk to. It was great being at her parties, right? It's like we have to think of these things as like being opposite of each other, instead of thinking of like, what if that state of embodiment is part of that delight, is like part of that experience. But because I think there's this way of thinking about the fat body that it's like people are inherently stupid and lazy and like all these things we associate with the fat body, or like society associates with the fat body, just creates this space where like we can't even just this basic way of like thinking like, what if that's part of it is like broken, like people can't access it. And it makes me really sad, because I feel like we actually miss out on this whole way of thinking about this entirely different set of like experiences, right? And actually I was just, before we got on the call, I was talking about a book that I was reading last night, very, very late into the night, by this writer named Gretchen Felker Martin, who's this like wonderful, fucking brilliant, fat, trans horror author here in the States. And she writes a lot. It's a big cast of characters. There's like a bunch of fat characters in it. And like the way that she talks about the fat body is so like beautiful and interesting. And it's just like you don't see it very often. Because it's like neutral to positive. It's just sort of like there's a whole sex scene where like one of the characters is like observing that how much he loves the feeling of like his lover's like body kind of like washing over him. This like kind of experience of like being kind of, and it's so, and I was like, you just so rarely see that, even though that's like a totally legitimate position of like reality, right? But like people just, I think, struggle with this piece of it. And I mean, like, I would certainly never say that like fatness is like the last oppression. Like there's, we got a lot of problems going on in all kinds of ways, but I do think that like people really struggle to think critically about fatness in the way they think critically about a lot of other like axes of oppression. Like I think people really, it's just like it's a newer space that people are exploring. Anyway, sorry, I'll get off my little this is the thing I clearly have a lot of feelings about, and I want to write about more, but
Yeah, this is great. I mean, I really hope you do write about it more. Um, so we do have some questions from YouTube, but I'm going to be a little selfish and ask you one more question before we head to YouTube. And I think this is a good segue into taking questions from our students specifically. So in some of your interviews and conversations you've had with people, you've talked about being more comfortable with fiction rather as opposed to nonfiction, and you say that it takes you because it's nonfiction, you have to be a lot more meticulous and kind of put words together carefully and make sure that everything's true in that sense. So I was thinking about that a little bit, and then I was also looking at your Substack and just kind of looking at your writing voice in terms of fiction and the other essays you write and your Substack. If you could just tell us a little bit about what it's like to use a platform like Substack or LiveJournal, which you had before, and what does that do for your writing, especially in a world that's political and requires you to say the right things in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, I cut my teeth on LiveJournal. That was like the format that like that was like my exact. I was like pre-Tumblr. Like I feel like that's like another. But yeah, I was that was like where I learned kind of to write for an audience. And like pretty quickly, and I started keeping LiveJournal when I was 15, and I kept it until I was about 25. And it was a space where I had to experiment with like essay writing, basically, and like I did write some fiction very occasionally, but it's weird because I feel more comfortable with fiction, but I do feel like it was this space where I was getting to see like how do you and I remember like having this thought even when I was on LiveJournal where like I would be like at my job, like I had this like I'd be at one of the million jobs that I had, and something would be happening to me, and I would already be in my brain being like, how am I going to write about this in LiveJournal? Like the essay, like the quality of how my brain was translating the experience I was having into writing was already happening, like as it was going on. And I mean, Substack is like a space where I get to be a little more informal. Like it's weird because I used to love Twitter. I don't anymore. I even pre everything. I left it a few years ago because it just felt like during COVID, everybody kind of collectively lost their minds, and I was like really struggling because people were just like being really, it was just too much. But I do like getting to have more like informal conversations with people about stuff that's really interesting to me, whether that stuff is writing related or not. So yeah, I don't know if that like answers your question, but yeah, I just feel like Substack for me is a space where I get to like play around with ideas, write little things, just kind of like it's a little more informal. So it's like nonfiction, but it's not the kind. It's not like because I feel like when I write, like essays take up so much energy for me, because essays, it's like writing from research is much harder than writing just like whatever. Because fiction, I'm like, I write whatever shit comes into my head. I don't know. It's very like weird.
Yeah.
Whereas like with an essay, I'm like, there's just so many, like there's so much stuff going on. And like, I don't know, I just finished an essay that I am writing, this assignment that I was given for this thing, and like it took me so long, and it's not even that long of a piece, but it just took me so long because it was just like doing all this research and pulling all these quotes and like watching a movie that I was writing about like 15 times. Like it just was so involved, and I don't, not that I don't like it, it's just like very time consuming, and it feels like a lot more, but like, it feels like fiction feels like more effortless to me. And then Substack is sort of in between because it's like I'm not like following the rules of like writing an essay the way I would for like a magazine where I have to like write with like beginning, middle, end. Like I have to like all the structural. I'm just sort of like, here's what I'm thinking about this. Here's some movie recs. Like here's this great dish that I made. Here's a thought I'm having about this pedagogical thing or whatever. Like it's a lot more just sort of like loosey goosey, structurally speaking. So it's easier.
Yeah.
But I do like having like a space, a more informal space. And I think it was Twitter for a long time. And then I for a while I didn't have any. And now I think that like Substack is sort of that space for me.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Okay. I think, I mean, I don't think I'll ever be out of questions, but we have to move to our students now. So I'll read out a couple of questions we're getting. Okay, so there's a question from Ananya Mehta, who is a second year student right now. She says, in stories like Inventory, you choose not to name the characters, but in other stories like Mothers, you give very definitive names like Bad. What guides this choice, whether to name a character or not? And for the ones you name, where do you pick their names from?
Oh, that is such a funny question. So a thing I did not realize I was doing in my first book until a journalist pointed out to me. I was like on tour for my first book, and a journalist was like, you always write in first person, almost always. And I was like, do I? And then I was like, oh, I guess I do. Realize. So oftentimes my protagonists are unnamed, not always, but often. And it is and yeah, and sometimes then like other characters get names. So like Bad, like and you can I feel like it's kind of, but Bad is sort of like, it's not even really a name. It's sort of like a moniker, right? Like it's a little more removed than like a name if it was like Joan or something. Generally speaking, names come from two places for me. Half the time it's a real person's name, not that it's the person. It's not like it's the person the character's based on, if any, because that actually doesn't happen nearly as often as people think, at least for me. Like, but it is helpful to me to use a name that in my brain there's like a face attached to it. It like helps me when I'm thinking about when I'm writing. So and oftentimes then at some point in the process I'll change the name. Because I'm like, I don't want us to go out with like my friend's name. Like that's kind of strange. But I don't always change the name. Like sometimes it just stays. It just sort of depends. But yeah, like when names appear and they are people that I know, often what's happening is I'm just like using the name as like a visual shortcut in my brain to like see a person's face, which is just like helping me sort of think about this person's like body in space. And then occasionally names just come to me and I just go roll with it. So like in Mothers, like Petra, I don't know. It's funny because I remember also getting an edit from a professor because Petra means stone, and at some point in the story she mentions she touched her and was like, you're like a stone, and I did not make that connection, at least not consciously, and my professor was like, great job, like Petra, stone, and I was like, oh yeah, totally on purpose, yep. But I think that Petra just like, I don't know, the name just like came to me and I was like, I'll just go with it, whatever. But names, yeah. And then sometimes I'll use stand-ins and sometimes the stand-ins just stick. I don't know. I'm currently writing something where like I'm using stand-in names, which I absolutely have to change because like they are a little closer to some real people and I have to like fuss with it a little more. But for right now, they just have the names they have, and at some point I'll switch it up. So I don't know. It's not a very precise process. I think it's just, and I think that sometimes, right, like monikers are more, or like stand-in are like more like, or like, you know, like in Inventory, it's closer to like how in a fairy tale you have like the girl, the boy, the mother, the witch, like you have these sort of names that are a little more abstract. I don't know. I think that's also kind of interesting to me in some ways. I wish I had a good answer to this question. I don't really. It's just, I just sort of do whatever feels right. It just sort of depends on what the story is. And
Okay. Shivali, do you want to say anything? Yeah? Okay.
No, I love that answer, and I never name my characters because I don't know how to. So
it's hard. I sympathize. I remember being like on LiveJournal as a young person and like using name generators for stuff occasionally.
I've tried that, yeah.
And like I do that sometimes if I'm just like really stuck. Or oftentimes I'll name characters. Like I'm working on right now where I just like took two names out of a Shirley Jackson story and used it in this other thing because I was like, why not? Who cares? It doesn't matter. I'll just use their names. Like I feel like names are, not that they're not important, but I think that like it can be kind of it's just kind of I don't know, it's just like a weird quirk of, I don't know, I guess writing different methods. But
Okay. Okay. I'll move on to the next question. Okay, there's Abby who says, I have felt held by the Dream House book, and it really inspired me to start theorizing about the horrors of conversion therapy I went through. How does one engage with the pain of the body, since writing is something we do with the body? Do we let our horrors re-haunt ourselves? How do you deal with this?
I mean, that is such a great question that does not have an easy answer. I mean, I think, you know, I've talked a lot about like when I was working on my memoir, how bad of a job I did taking care of my own mental health while I was doing that. I did like a terrible job, like do not recommend, like really set myself up for failure. Like I went away to like the wilderness. I stopped going to therapy. I was like just kind of alone and cut off from my own circles and my own sort of, you know, and it was just like not great. And I think that like I was being a little cavalier about it. I was like, I'll be fine, I'll be fine, I'll be fine. And then I wasn't fine. So like I think that like you always have to be mindful. It's like it's hard because it's like on one hand, like it's important, like when your body, like when you are having that kind of experience, it means that you've landed on something deep, like a deep well of feeling or experience, right? Which is like nothing to sneeze at, like as an artist, right? Like that can be a space of great richness and great discovery, and it's a place you can really focus your practice. And also you have to take care of yourself, and you have to like, you know, you have to get to the other side of it and like be okay. And so I think the thing that I sort of talk about is like, there's nothing you have to write about. Like no one, and I said this in like various capacities when I've taught like nonfiction classes, which is like, you are not the worst thing that ever happened to you. And like, no one is going to hold a gun to your head and be like, you must write about, for example, conversion therapy, or like you must write about your sexual assault, or you must write about your whatever. Like I feel like, and I feel like we live because of just like the internet and like the personal essay machine, especially people who exist in marginalized bodies, were told that like, we're going to make you write about the worst thing that ever happened to you. We're going to pay you $100 for like, you know, for writing about the worst thing that ever happened to you. And you will be grateful and you will do it. And then everyone will leave you nasty comments and then it'll be horrible. Right. And like, we've just come to expect this from people. And it makes me really sad because I'm like, you can decide whether or not you write directly about that thing. And that's up to you. It's entirely up to you. And no one can make you do it or not do it. If you do decide to do it, you do have to like, I think, make a plan. And the plan is like, am I the correct amount of distance for myself away from this? If it's like a fixed event. So like this happened when I was this old, it's now 10 years later. Like, do I feel like emotionally, mentally ready to like go into this material? Because also like, I think that a thing that happens too is if you try to write from like a half-baked emotional state where you're not like sufficiently distanced from the thing, what comes out is just a mess because you're still processing. You're still in the middle of like a grief process or like a process of trying to like make sense of like what happened. So like, are you in the right space? Do you want to write about it at all? And also just thinking practically about like things like exposure, which like I think we don't talk about a lot. And like, it's hard because obviously people love my memoir, and the thing that keeps me going about the memoir is that I know that it's helped a lot of people and people really respond to it. And I love that. And also sometimes I wish I hadn't written it because it was so hard. It was so, not because of like the response in the world, but because like it was so hard on me. And I think that writing that book made me a different person. And I think that like, and that was a choice that I made, and I made it, and I can't go back and change it. And also it was like it was like a really real, like, I don't want to undersell how real that can be to like go back into that material, to like re-access that space. And so I think that you have to just have like a super honest conversation with yourself about like where you are, what it would mean to go back into this. And you have to like take steps to like protect it, whether it's like, you know, your mental health, like whatever you need for your mental health, the people around you, the space that you've created for yourself, and you have to be really honest about that. And I think that one of my worst personality traits is that I get a little cavalier about stuff until I'm like in the middle of it. And then I'm like, oh no, I made a huge mistake. And that's like a thing about my personality that like I have to It's just a thing about me, the reality of being me. But I think one has to be really honest about that, which is not to discourage you. Like if that's a thing you really want to do, like I encourage you to do it and to set yourself up for success. And also know that like I said, you're not the worst thing that ever happened to you. You don't have to write about that at all. Or there are other ways to write about it. Like nonfiction is only one method. Like there are other ways to approach, like other forms of not just even writing, but like art to like approach stuff that like might be different or better. So yeah, I don't know if I have like a great concluding thought to that, but I wish you the best. I mean, that's like that part, that trying to figure that part out is like so hard. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I can't imagine how hard it was to write it, but thank you for writing it. I return to it very often, and I know lots of students do, lots of other queer people I know do keep returning to it. It's priceless. Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Uh,
Thanks.
okay, we'll go to the next question. This is a question from an Utkarsh Saraswat. As a budding queer writer, I would really like to know how to approach topics that can be incredibly sensitive for people without causing harm to an already marginalized community.
Mhm. This might be like a controversial answer. I can't tell from the question if you're referring to your own community, if the question asker is referring to their own community or to other communities they are not a part of. My answer does not well, it changes slightly. Like when I was working on the memoir, I remember like having this like very intense, I mean, part of my like spiral and my intense like mental state was like being like, what does it mean to like write about my own community in this way, where I'm talking about this like problem that goes unstated? Like what does it mean to like say this stuff out loud? And I worried, and like I did get pushback from people who were like, you had no business writing about this, or a different person should have written about this, or this was not the way to write about this, or you can't like air our dirty laundry. And I think this is true of like any marginalized community that anyone belongs to is going to have intra-community or intercommunity, yes, intercommunity, like stuff that like to write about it or talk about it or like put it to the page where it can be accessed by other people like that are not part of that community. That's like a very real concern, and I don't want to like dismiss it. And also to go back to what I was saying before, like you do have to write the thing that burns inside. I think you have to write it. Like if you're like, I must do this, this is really important to me, like there are like I mean, there's ways to do things badly or in an irresponsible way, certainly, yes. But I think that like you, in some ways, I think that like a symptom of our social media age, not to sound like so old, I feel like such a like senior millennial right now, but like an elder millennial, but like to speak to our social media age is this kind of defensive writing, this like defensive position on art that I think often creates, it's not good. Like I don't think it's good for art for people to be operating from the position of defensiveness at all times. This is not to say that you shouldn't, if you're like writing about a community that is not yours, that you shouldn't be like, you should be like, whatever, who cares? Like you have to be, like you can do things badly. You can write a sexist book, a racist book, a homophobic, like it's possible to do that, obviously, right? And to like do it badly. But I also think that like I think right now, just in this moment of like extreme defensiveness, and I can't imagine it's good for work. And I think that like, I often when I read it, I can feel it. Like I can feel that state of defensiveness in people who are like holding back because they're like afraid of something that people might say about a piece of writing. And I think that also people have this idea that something has to be perfect to be good, which also is not true. Like I think that like there's a lot of work that I love that has spoken to me that is like problematic in all kinds of like really intense ways, but there's still there's like kind of a kernel of truth inside of it that is like so essential that like I'm so glad this text exists even in its imperfect state, right? So yeah, I think that like obviously be cautious, do your research, do what you have to do to like do a good job. And also you cannot be afraid. Like you cannot be operating from a place of fear, because you're never going to make good stuff operating from a place of fear. Like it's not possible.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Okay, so there's Angel who is a former student. She says, when I read In the Dream House, I noticed that amidst the pain and the abuse, it also captures very tender moments of care. Like, for instance, when your very Republican Uncle Nick says, "Your heart is broken, I understand. Everyone's heart breaks in the same way." I'm curious to know a bit more about how care appears on the page and how writing about pain also allows you to think about care and perhaps, in extension, community.
That's a great question. I mean, I think that like this is true. So when you're writing about stuff that's really intense, you cannot forget that like there's a reader experience of that text. Okay, so like, sorry, I'm back up. I remember having a conversation with my editor really early on writing the memoir, where he was like, there has to be some levity in this book. There has to be some kind of lightness or like aeration or effervescence, because if it's just relentless, the reader can't handle that, right? And like, I'm sure you, anyone watch it, like have the experience like reading a book where you're like, this is like too much. I have to put this down. Like I can't. Or like there have been books that I've read where I've been like, these are good books, but I can only read it like a tiny bite at a time because it's so intense and there's just no break. Like there's no, it's very relentless in this way, which is not, I think there's reasons why one might do that, but like that was not the experience I wanted people to have. And so also a thing that was important about writing the memoir was acknowledging that like it would be easy to write a book about like an abuser who is always bad, like a person who is abusive and also is always an asshole, or like in the case of the detail that this person mentioned, an uncle who's like, who I am opposed to politically in every way conceivable, who is like a conservative Republican, just like as opposite of me as possible, who is also capable of this moment of like tenderness and like human connection, right? And I think that like, again, not to sound so old, but like I think we have gotten very used to, I mean, I think part of it is like honestly a symptom of like the fact that like in the US we have like a cartoon villain running for president who was also previously the president. Like because Trump, there's none of that in Trump. Like it's really weird actually, because it's like even with like, I don't know, other Republican candidates, that we sort of gravitate toward these moments of like shared humanity. Trump is like a weird exception because he's just so insane and so awful. But like truly, I do think that like we exist in this polarized state where like we think if someone does one bad thing, all things must be bad. If someone even does a lot of bad things, that there's no humanity or no common ground. And I think this also is important to think about when we think about questions like domestic violence, because I think that if you think all domestic violence like abusers are cartoon villains who will be obvious from the first moment, then you misunderstand the nature of domestic violence, right? That like people are complex, and like people who can commit acts of violence, whatever they are also capable of like human feeling and emotion and human shared connection, which is just like and like I think that people they're like, well, I'll recognize that right away because we all know that those people are like universally awful. And it's like, well, but that's not how humans are, right? Like people do actually have these like little, and you can acknowledge that without like forgiving bad behavior, right? You can say like a person can have this moment of like vulnerability or tenderness or goodness or connection or community or whatever, and also be doing things that we're like, that's not okay. That's not, So like, I think for me, it was important to create a book where like those moments of humanity did it. Because also like, one of the hardest things for that memoir was like writing about the good stuff, right? Like thinking about like remember how it felt to be like so in love and so horny and so happy and so like beside being like, oh my God, like I've met my soul, and like it's really hard to access that in the future once I know how the story turns out, right? But that's also a really important part of it, is that like there are these moments of like earnestness and like vulnerability that are like real, right? And there were good moments, and there were moments of connection. And I think that this also, again, this is like how you can't operate from this like defensive space. It's like people are complex, stories are complex, and I think that if we think of people as very flat, we lose humanity. Like we lose people's sense of humanity. And I think, and this is also like I talk in the memoir about like queer villains and why I love queer villains and how in the rush to condemn the homophobia of the queer villain as an archetype, we then miss the deliciousness of the queer villain as a figure who like occupies the complexity of the queer experience, where sometimes you're gay and a villain. Right? So I don't know. This is not like a great, like super coherent answer, but I just feel like there's nothing to be gained from flattening any of these things, whatever direction you're coming from. And I think that like accessing those tender spaces is the way that you make things real and you articulate their realness. Yeah, I think that's it. That's the end of my thought.
Okay. All right. It's been an hour. I think we're out of time, but I mean, I've said this before, so I'm going to just be repeating myself, but I can't tell you how special this has been. I think for all of our students and for all of us here, one thing that today's conversation has also done is um, uh, allow us and kind of push us to think about what it means to write, but also what it means to occupy space, to be, to relate with the world in lots of different ways. And it has been very enlightening, if nothing else. And I'm very glad that you were able to come here. Our students are constantly thinking about or engaging with questions of being in a very political sense, whether we're looking at gender, queerness, caste, class, or whatever else. And with the interesting mix of students we have in our university, I think to address writing politically is something that we need to keep returning to. And I think we've in some sense been able to do that today. And since your writing is also teaching us how to be in different ways, whether it's through genre or whether it's through simply recognizing a moment and kind of documenting it. We have lots to thank you for. So thank you for all of your time. Thank you for all your very generous answers. I think we'll all leave this session feeling very happy and very enriched. If I may ask one more small question, just
Sure.
to kind of end the session with. I was curious about your the relationship between teaching and writing for you. I think that would be a good note to end on because I mean, we're teachers here, we're writers, so yes.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's funny because before I came to grad school, because I came to grad school and like part of me coming here was teaching, having to teach. And before that, I had no idea if I even wanted to teach, like that was something that I would be good at and I instantly loved it. And I love it so much that even though I don't really like I have other things kind of going on and I can't even really teach full time because I'm just so busy with my other projects, like I love it and I try to do as much as I can because I find it so rewarding and I find it so exciting. And I think that teaching is this space that it's like so much of writing becomes like internalized. Like the more you do it, especially when you've like left the school space and you've left like kind of the workshop space, there's so much happening internally, right? Where you're just like sitting with yourself kind of every day. And teaching is an opportunity for me to get to like articulate things that I sort of take for granted. So actually, like I was just writing on my Substack the other day and thinking about like a moment that happened in my class last fall where a student had like expressed something and I was like, oh, that's so interesting. I'd never heard that phrase that way before. And it was a really like clarifying moment for me, this other thought I was having about writing and you know, and it was really great. And so I feel like, yeah, for me, it's this chance to get to like almost like workshop ideas and like ways of approaching things like craft, for example. And I just find that really useful. I find that really, I don't know. It's like I can't imagine my life without it. I can't imagine like not teaching. It really is like the most wonderful sort of helpful thing. So yeah, I don't know. It's always kind of gone hand in hand with my writing for me, and I really love it, and I try to do it whenever I can. So
Thank you so much. I don't know if it makes sense, but I feel very reassured by the fact that you're also teaching writing.
I mean, it's hard because teaching is so, I mean, as you know, like teaching takes so much energy out of you. Like teaching, I mean, for me, like whenever I teach, like I come back from teaching and I like lie down because I'm like, it's just, you know, it's performative. It's a lot of energy to teach. And so it can be hard to like marry that with like a creative practice. And yet I still try to do it because I'm like, I do love it so much. And it is like so rewarding. And I do find it, yeah, it's like really, it is so helpful to me in the long run. So yeah, it's possible. It's hard, but it's possible for those things to be together.
Okay. Shefali, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, no, I thought Carmen should know. I was walking with two people who were in your workshop last semester, and the whole conversation, we walked from Prairie Lights to my house, which is near Dye House. They were talking about your workshop and how much they loved it. And so I thought you should know how much your teaching means to them also.
Oh, thank you. I think it can be such a dreamy experience to teach. I mean, I do really like, even when I'm tired and like even when classes worn me out, I'm still like, that was really great. That was so fun. Like that was so, I don't know. Yeah. So I'm glad to hear that. That makes me so happy.
Okay. All right. I think then we've taken enough of your time already. Thank you so much. I hope we get to see you again at some point in the future.
Yeah,
And
thanks for having me.
thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much.
Yes.
Of
Thank you to,
course.
Wonderful. It's so beautiful.
thank
All
you to
right. Bye,
everyone watching.
Rosie.
Bye. Take care. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
You. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you. Okay, thank you to everyone for staying till the end, and this brings an end to Meta 2024, and we'll see you tomorrow for our Linguistic Society Fest semantics. Thank you. Thank you, Shefali.
Thank you, Drishti. Thank you.